I still remember the weight of the fog that morning, the kind that settles low over the wharf and makes the world feel quieter than it should be. I was tying down the last of my nets when I saw a man standing at the end of the pier. Still, patient, like he'd been waiting for me long before I arrived. He didn't belong to our little harbor in Nova Scotia. Everything about him felt slightly misplaced. His coat too clean, his posture too careful, his eyes fixed on me as if he already knew what I'd say before I said it. That was the first moment I felt a tremor of unease, though I tried to ignore it. He walked toward me with a calm, almost somber expression, stopping just close enough for me to see the faint strain around his eyes. "Ray," he said, quiet, steady, like someone delivering news they wish they didn't have to repeat. I didn't ask how he knew my name. Something in his voice made it feel like the least important question I could ask. Before I could find my words, he reached into his coat and pulled out a thin, worn photograph, holding it between us with both hands, as if it might break. I didn't want to take it. I don't know why. Instinct, maybe. A sense that whatever was on that piece of paper wasn't meant for ordinary morning light. But he waited, unmoving, until I reached out. The moment my fingers brushed the edge, I felt a strange coldness run through me, the kind that doesn't come from the sea. The man, Adrian, he finally said his name, watched my reaction carefully, almost painfully. The photograph showed me standing on a rocky outcrop I recognized instantly. I'd fished those waters since I was a boy, but the version of me in the picture looked older, tired, and completely alone. No boat behind me, no gear, just me standing there with both hands slightly raised, like I was acknowledging something I couldn't see in the frame. Something important, something heavy. "This is the last photo of you," Adrian said softly. "The last one that exists." His voice wasn't dramatic. It wasn't meant to frighten me. It sounded regretful, as if he wished the future he carried wasn't the one he had to place in my hands. I wanted to ask why I was alone, why I looked the way I did, but before I could speak I realized he was already stepping back, as if my reaction was something he couldn't bear to witness again. The photograph stayed in my hands long after Adrian disappeared into the fog. I kept staring at it, trying to understand the expression on my own face. I looked older, yes, but not sick, not frightened, just resigned, like a man who knew something had run its course. The rocky outcrop behind me was a place I'd visited 100 times, yet in the picture, the tides were higher, the sky dimmer, the air somehow heavier. Nothing in it felt like a moment I remembered living. I slipped the photo into my jacket and walked toward my boat, hoping a familiar deck and familiar tasks would shake off the unease. But even the routine felt different that morning. Every sound, the gulls, the creak of the ropes, the slow slap of water against the hull, seemed to echo the same quiet question. Why am I alone in the future? And why did Adrian hand the photo to me with such grief in his eyes? When I finally pushed off from the harbor, the sea was calm, but my thoughts weren't. I tried to convince myself the picture was a trick, a staged image meant to unsettle me. But as I felt the paper through the fabric of my coat, I knew that wasn't true. The man who gave it to me hadn't come to scare me. His expression held something closer to sorrow. By midday, the clouds thickened, turning the horizon into a long, gray line. I kept glancing at the place where Adrian had stood earlier, half expecting him to reappear. But the pier was empty, and the fog had swallowed any trace of him. The silence pushed me back to a thought I didn't want to name. Maybe the future version of me had chosen solitude, or maybe solitude had chosen him. Hi, my name is Ray. If you're enjoying this story, I'd be grateful if you subscribe to the channel. Have you ever wondered what you'd do if someone showed you a moment from your own future? Thank you for being here with me. Now let's get back to the story. The first hour on the water usually clears my thoughts, but that day the sea didn't give me any room to breathe. The photograph burned in my jacket pocket like a quiet warning. I didn't take it out again. Not yet. I didn't want my hands to shake while I worked. Fishing demands a steady rhythm, especially in the early hours when the cold still sits heavy on your fingers and the nets feel twice their weight. I started with my usual route, letting the boat roll along the line where the harbor's shelter fades and the open sea begins. The sky held a pale, washed-out blue, the kind that makes the morning feel older than it is. I kept looking toward the horizon, though I didn't expect to see Adrian out there. He had appeared with the same quiet certainty as the tide, and I had the feeling he would vanish just as easily. What stayed with me wasn't his voice or the way he said my name. It was his expression, the way he looked at me like someone who had already watched the result of a choice I hadn't made yet. I replayed that moment so many times I barely noticed the early catch pulling at the lines. When I hauled the first net in, I moved by habit alone. The fish were smaller than usual, but I didn't care. My mind kept drifting to the place shown in the photograph, the rocky outcrop north of the bay, just beyond the old lighthouse. I had gone there more times than I could count to watch storms approach or to clear my thoughts after long days. But in the picture, I wasn't looking at the sea. I was looking at something, or someone, out of frame. My hands were raised slightly, not in fear, but in acknowledgement, recognition, as if I knew exactly what stood before me, even though the photograph stopped short of showing it. A quiet wind picked up, brushing cold air across the deck. I tightened my grip on the rail and let the boat drift for a few minutes. I didn't want to admit it out loud, but the truth was obvious. The man in the picture didn't look surprised. He looked like someone who had been waiting for that moment all his life, and he looked completely alone. I tried to remember if anyone had taken my picture recently. No one had, not in years. Birthdays had faded into simple dinners. Holidays had become quiet evenings at home. Most people in town kept to themselves, and I wasn't much different. Solitude wasn't something I feared, but seeing it printed on paper, seeing the future version of it, felt like a warning I didn't know how to read. By mid-morning, the tide began to shift. I started the engine and moved farther out, letting the boat cut through the gentle swells. The routine helped a little, but not enough to silence the loop of questions running through my head. Who was Adrian? Why did he carry a photograph of me? How many times had he done this before, handing someone a piece of their own future? When I finally pulled back on the throttle, the boat slowed to a quiet drift. I reached into my jacket and took out the photograph, holding it carefully by the edges. The paper was colder than it should have been, almost damp, though I knew it hadn't touched the water. I studied the version of myself in the picture again, the way my shoulders slumped slightly, the set of my jaw, the faint lines around my eyes that weren't there yet on my own face. I started counting the details the way fishermen count weather signs, the tide line behind me, the pattern of seaweed on the rocks, the low clouds hanging close to the water. None of it pointed to danger. If anything, the scene looked peaceful, the kind of afternoon you could spend in silence without feeling lonely, unless that silence was all you had left. A sound behind me made me turn quickly, but it was only a rope settling against the deck. Still, it reminded me that I wasn't ready to face the place in the photo. Not yet. I folded it gently and put it away. I needed to understand what Adrian had shown me. More than that, I needed to understand why I was the one standing alone. And deep down, though I tried to ignore it, another question took shape. Quiet, insistent, impossible to shake. Why did he call it my last photo? The sun managed to break through a thin stretch of cloud by late morning, laying a pale line of light across the water. It should have felt comforting, but instead it sharpened everything. The color of the waves, the sound of the gulls, the quiet weight of the photograph inside my jacket. I tried to focus on the work ahead of me, sorting the catch and preparing for the next drop. Yet every small task felt like a distraction from something I didn't know how to face. As I untangled the last net, a thought struck me with a clarity that made me pause. If the photograph was real, if it truly came from my future, then the moment it showed hadn't happened yet, and that meant I still had time before whatever led me there unfolded. Time to change something, time to understand something, or maybe time to accept something I had been avoiding. The idea didn't comfort me. It made the air feel heavier. I leaned back against the side of the boat and closed my eyes. Adrian's face appeared in my mind with a sharpness I didn't expect, the way he spoke my name, the tired look he carried, like someone who had delivered bad news too many times. He hadn't acted like a man trying to interfere with my life. He acted like someone who believed the future was already set. That's what scared me most. I opened my eyes again and scanned the horizon. The water stretched clean and wide, the kind of calm afternoon fishermen respect because it never lasts. I knew these waters like the lines of my own hands, yet ever since seeing that photograph, they didn't feel familiar. They felt like something I needed to prove wrong. After a long moment, I reached into my jacket and unfolded the picture again. I forced myself to study it more carefully this time. The rocks beneath my feet were wet, meaning the tide was either rising or had just begun to fall. The sky was dim, as if late afternoon, and my stance, my posture, looked deliberate, like I wasn't caught off guard, like I had walked there knowing exactly what I was going to face. The worst part was the look in my eyes. Not fear, not confusion, just acceptance. A quiet acknowledgement of something beyond the frame. I lowered the picture slowly. The sea sighed beneath the hull as if waiting for my reaction. Adrian had said it was the last photo of me. He hadn't explained why, and in that moment I realized he didn't need to. My fear wasn't about dying. Fishermen live with that possibility every day. My fear was the solitude, the way I stood in the picture as if no one else in my life mattered anymore. Or worse, as if I had allowed everyone to slip away without noticing. I rubbed a hand across my face and looked toward the north, in the direction of the old lighthouse. The rocky outcrop lay just beyond it, hidden from view but close enough to reach within an hour if I pushed the engine hard. The thought of going there made my chest tighten, but ignoring it wouldn't make the future disappear. If anything, avoiding it felt like walking blindfolded toward the same moment shown in the photograph. For the first time that day, I admitted something to myself. I needed to see that place again. Not to change anything, not to stop anything, just to understand. I secured the nets, cleaned the deck, and started the engine. The boat vibrated beneath my feet, steady and familiar. As I angled toward the north point, I glanced once more at the photograph. A strange thought hit me, one I hadn't considered until that moment. In the picture, the sea behind me was calm, flat, almost glassy. But today, despite the mild weather, the water carried a restless chop, which meant the moment in the photograph wasn't today, not even close. The tide was different, the sky was different, the wind was different. Whatever that photograph showed, it was a specific day, a specific hour, a moment waiting for me like a destination carved into time. As I steered toward the lighthouse, a quiet certainty settled into my chest. Something was coming, and I needed to reach that outcrop before it found me first. The lighthouse came into view slowly, rising through a thin sheet of mist that clung to the water's surface. I'd seen it thousands of times over the years, but that afternoon it felt different, like a marker between the life I'd known and the one that waited on the other side of the photograph. Its white paint was weathered, chipped by storms and salt, yet the tower still stood straight, unbothered by time. I wondered, for the first time, what I would look like if time had worn me down the same way. As I brought the boat closer to the northern point, the sound of the waves grew steadier. The rocky outcrop where the picture had been taken lay just beyond a curve of jagged stone. I slowed the engine and let the boat drift for a moment, trying to steady my breathing. A quiet feeling settled in my stomach, something between dread and obligation. It wasn't the fear of what I'd find. It was the fear of what I already knew was waiting in me. I tied off the line to a small metal ring wedged into the rock years ago, one I'd used whenever I came here to think or cool my head. The rope stretched tight with each pull of the tide. Climbing onto the rocks, I felt the cold surface through the soles of my boots. The wind pushed back the fog in slow breaths, revealing the familiar shape of the outcrop. Uneven stone, dark patches of seaweed, and shallow pools left behind by the retreating water. I walked to the exact spot from the photograph almost without thinking. My boots found the same footholds they always had, as if my body remembered the path long before the picture ever existed. When I reached the center of the outcrop, I stopped. The angle, the horizon line, the shape of the clouds, they weren't the same as the picture, but I could see the frame in my mind. A future version of me had stood here, quietly, willingly. I tried to imagine what I had been looking at. The photograph didn't show it. The image cut off just before the answer. I turned my head slowly, scanning the shoreline behind me. Nothing unusual, no figures, no shadows, just the lighthouse, the water, and the steady hum of the wind. But then I heard something, a soft scrape of stone behind me. I turned quickly. Nothing, just the rocks settling as the tide shifted. Still, the sound made my pulse thicken. My hand drifted to my jacket, touching the photograph as if to reassure myself it was still there. I pulled it out and studied it again, comparing every detail. The tide line in the photograph was higher, meaning the moment shown hadn't happened yet. The sky was darker too, heavy with an overcast that wasn't present today. This wasn't the day. Not yet. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the breeze cool my face. The smell of salt water felt stronger here, mixed with the faint scent of seaweed drying under the sun. I breathed slowly, trying to find some meaning in the silence. But the longer I stood there, the clearer it became. The photograph wasn't a warning. It wasn't a threat. It was an appointment. An appointment I hadn't chosen, but one I would eventually keep. A sudden memory surfaced, one I hadn't thought of in years. Standing here with my wife on a late summer afternoon, long before she passed. She had laughed at something I said, brushing her hair back as the wind tugged at it. I hadn't remembered that moment until now. I hadn't remembered the way the light hit her face, or how calm the sea had been that day. That realization settled over me with a quiet sadness. Maybe the future version of me wasn't meeting someone out of fear. Maybe he was remembering something, or someone. I folded the photograph again, more gently this time, and slipped it back into my jacket. The question that had followed me all morning returned with a sharper edge. Why was I alone? Why wasn't there anyone left beside me in that future? The tide was changing again, rising faster than before. I stepped back from the edge of the outcrop and began the slow walk toward my boat, the rocks slick beneath my boots. As I reached the rope and untied it, I felt the fog begin to roll in again, thicker, heavier, almost deliberate. The moment in the photograph wasn't today, but the day was coming, and whatever waited for me on this outcrop, I was getting closer to it. The fog followed me back toward the harbor, moving in slow sheets that blurred the coastline into soft shapes. By the time I tied the boat to the dock, the day had settled into a muted gray, the kind that makes every sound feel distant. I stepped onto the boards and felt the damp wood shift slightly under my boots. It struck me then that I had been gone longer than I intended. The tide had turned twice since morning, and the hours between had slipped away without me noticing. As I walked toward the storage shed to put away my gear, I kept replaying the scene from the outcrop in my mind. The sense of recognition I'd felt there didn't fade with distance. It followed me like a familiar ache. I knew I'd stand on that rock again, on the day shown in the photograph. I didn't know why, and that uncertainty gnawed at me in a way the sea never had. Inside the shed, I set down my equipment and leaned against the counter. The smell of salt and old rope hung thick in the air. I'd always found comfort in that scent, a reminder of a life built quietly and honestly. But now it felt different, like the smell of a place that couldn't protect me from whatever was coming. I pulled the photograph from my jacket again, and even under the dim light of the shed, the image looked painfully clear. My future self stood alone, not lost, not confused, just alone. I studied the edges of the photo once more. The rocks behind me in the image were wet. The sky carried heavy clouds. The air looked cold. I traced the shapes without touching the surface, trying to match them to seasons I remembered. Late fall, maybe. Early winter. A time when the wind cut sharper and the sea darkened early. But there was something else. Something I hadn't noticed before. A faint outline behind the figure of me. Not a person. Not an object. Just a darker shape. Like the shadow of something I might have been facing. I lifted the photo closer, squinting. But the outline didn't sharpen. It stayed vague, like an unfinished thought. I lowered the picture, frustration tightening my chest. If Adrian had wanted me to understand something, he hadn't given me enough to work with, and maybe that was the point. I tucked the photo safely back in my jacket and stepped outside. The fog had thickened, rolling over the harbor in slow, deliberate waves. A few boats rocked gently in their slips, their ropes creaking in the damp air. A stray gull perched on a piling, its feathers puffed against the cold. Everything looked as it always had, and yet I felt as if I'd stepped into a version of the world slightly out of place. As I made my way toward home, the sound of footsteps echoed behind me on the boards. I stopped and turned, expecting to see another fisherman or someone from town finishing their work. But the dock was empty. Only the fog drifted through the air, thick enough to hide anything more than a few feet away. I waited a moment, listening. Nothing. Just water and wood. Still, the feeling that someone had been walking behind me lingered, making the hair on my arms rise. I walked a little faster, telling myself I'd imagined it. People hear things in fog all the time. Echoes, shifts in the air, the rhythm of the tide turning. It didn't have to mean anything. But deep down, I remembered something. Adrian hadn't approached me from behind when he appeared that morning. He'd been standing there already, as if he had arrived without footsteps at all. The thought followed me into the narrow path that led toward my house. The small homes along the road stood quiet, their windows fogged from the cold. A dog barked somewhere behind a fence, the sound muffled. Everything felt ordinary and impossibly distant at the same time. I closed my door behind me and leaned my back against it, letting out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. The house felt warmer than I expected, but also emptier. The kind of emptiness that comes not from space, but from knowing something is missing. I pulled off my jacket, folded it carefully, and placed it on the table. The photograph was still inside, and though I tried not to look at it again, I couldn't help it. There I was, standing on those rocks, hands lifted slightly, facing a moment I couldn't yet understand. And for the first time since morning, a quiet thought found its way into my mind. Maybe I wasn't meant to understand it alone. I set the photograph on the table and stepped into the kitchen to boil water for tea, hoping it would ground me. The kettle sat heavy in my hands, colder than I expected. I filled it, placed it on the stove, and leaned against the counter while the flame came alive beneath it. The faint hiss of heating metal filled the room, soft but sharp enough to keep my thoughts from drifting too far. Still, they drifted anyway. All day I had tried to make sense of the moment Adrian had shown me, but the truth pressed deeper than I cared to admit. I wasn't afraid of the future itself. I was afraid of what version of me would stand in that photograph. A man who had accepted something I hadn't yet faced. A man who had no one beside him at a moment that clearly mattered. The kettle began to warm, and I instinctively reached for the old tin of tea leaves on the shelf. The motion felt automatic, comforting, like part of a routine that had carried me through the quiet years after my wife passed. But tonight, the familiarity only made the silence feel heavier. I realized how long I had gone without making tea for anyone but myself. I poured the steaming water into a mug and carried it to the table. The photograph lay beside it, half shadowed by the dim kitchen light. I turned the mug slowly between my hands, letting the warmth soak into my palms. I kept my eyes on the picture, almost daring it to reveal something new. Then I noticed the corner of the photograph curling slightly upward, as if touched by damp air, or worn by time in a way the rest of it wasn't. I reached for it and felt the faintest tremble in the paper, like a heartbeat. I pulled my hand back quickly, unsure whether the tremor came from the photo or from me. I needed air. I stepped outside onto the small porch, the boards creaking under my weight. The fog had thickened into a low blanket rolling past the houses, swallowing the far end of the road. A street lamp flickered at the corner, the kind of flicker that always came before the bulb gave out completely. I watched it pulse in the mist, feeling that same sense of imbalance I'd felt on the docks. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. Not behind me, not ahead, somewhere in the fog. Slow, steady, not rushed. The rhythm of someone walking with purpose, not wandering. "Hello?" I called out. The sound stopped. I took a step forward, squinting into the thick white curtain. Nothing moved, no shadow, no sound. Just the faint glow of the street lamp flickering against the fog. I waited, listening. I could hear the distant hum of the sea, but nothing else. "Adrian?" I tried, though even I wasn't sure why. No answer. I stepped down from the porch, the damp air brushing against my face. I walked a few feet onto the gravel path, crunching the stones under my boots. The fog swirled around my legs, cool and dense, drifting in slow patterns like breath. I felt watched, but not threatened, just observed, the way someone would watch a man walking toward a decision he doesn't yet understand. The footsteps didn't return. After a while, I turned back to the house. The porch light cast a soft halo across the steps, making the fog glow faintly around it. When I stepped inside again and closed the door, it felt like shutting out a presence that hadn't decided whether to enter. I walked back to the table, my breath still a little unsteady. The photograph lay exactly where I'd left it. I sat down and lifted it again, forcing myself to look past what troubled me and into what made sense. The tidal pattern, the cloud cover, the rocks, the angle of my stance. If the moment in the photo wasn't today and not yesterday, then it was somewhere ahead, somewhere near but not immediate. That meant the future was still open, still changeable if such a thing mattered. Yet Adrian hadn't spoken like a man who believed futures could shift. He'd spoken like someone who had already walked mine, watched it unfold, and come back with the one piece he wasn't supposed to give me. I lowered the photograph slowly, and for the first time, the thought came quietly, almost without permission. What if the future wasn't something happening to me? What if it was something I was already walking toward, step by step, choice by choice? And what if Adrian wasn't here to warn me? What if he was here to make sure I got there? I stayed at the table longer than I meant to, staring at the photograph as if the answer might slip out of it on its own. The tea had grown cold in front of me, but I barely noticed. My mind kept circling the same questions, all leading back to the one thing I couldn't shake. The possibility that Adrian hadn't given me the photo to change what was coming, but to prepare me for it. Eventually, the stillness of the house began to settle uncomfortably on my skin. I stood up and moved to the small living room, turning on the old lamp beside the window. Its warm light pushed back the shadows, though not enough to make the place feel less empty. I sat on the worn couch, leaning forward with my elbows on my knees. The photograph rested loosely between my fingers, and I found myself tracing the edges, careful not to touch the image itself. For a moment I closed my eyes, trying to imagine standing on that rocky outcrop as the older version of myself. I pictured the cold air on my face, the tide rising behind me, the clouds hanging low. But what unsettled me wasn't the loneliness of the scene. It was the familiarity. I knew that version of myself. I knew the weight in my shoulders, the quiet acceptance in my eyes. I had carried pieces of that expression for years without fully realizing it. A soft sound outside pulled me from my thoughts. Not footsteps this time, something lighter, a shifting of gravel, a brief scrape, almost hesitant. I lifted my head and listened, but the sound didn't repeat. Whatever, or whoever it was, hadn't lingered long. I stood and walked to the window, pulling the curtain back slightly. The fog had thinned near the house, drifting in long ribbons across the yard. The street lamp at the corner had stopped flickering and now glowed steadily, casting a faint light over the empty road. Nothing moved, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been standing just beyond the porch a moment earlier. I let the curtain fall back into place. The quiet pressed in again. I returned to the couch and leaned back, forcing my thoughts to settle. I knew I needed rest, but sleep felt impossible. My mind was too alert, too aware of the shifting edges of the day. The photograph felt heavier now, as though the future it carried had started to lean into the present. After a while, I placed the photograph on the coffee table and stood up. My legs ached slightly from the cold and the long hours on the boat. I stretched and walked toward the small hallway that led to my bedroom. But halfway there, I stopped. The photograph wasn't lying exactly where I'd set it. It had shifted, only by a fraction of an inch, barely noticeable. But I was certain I had placed it straight and centered on the table. And now it rested slightly angled, as if nudged. I stared at it, my pulse tightening in my chest. I wasn't imagining it. I knew I wasn't. I took a slow step forward, then another, forcing myself not to turn away. The room felt colder than before, though no window was open. I reached the table and hovered my hand above the photograph, unsure whether to pick it up or leave it where it was. Eventually, I lifted it. The edges felt dry, the surface cool. Nothing abnormal, nothing that should have moved on its own. Adrian, I whispered under my breath, though the name felt too small for the weight of the moment. Was he still nearby, watching, waiting? Had he moved the photograph, or had something else happened? Something I wasn't prepared to understand. I sat again, the photograph resting against my palms. For the first time, I noticed something faint near the bottom edge, an almost invisible smudge, like the trace of a thumbprint. But it wasn't mine. My hands were clean, dry, and the print was too fresh, as if someone had touched it only moments before. Someone had handled the photograph while I wasn't looking. I exhaled slowly, a trembling breath I couldn't hide. The house no longer felt empty, not in the usual way. There was a presence in the quiet, not hostile, not comforting, just there, filling the air with a kind of expectation. I looked around the room, the photograph clutched in my hands, and realized the truth settling over me like a slow tide. This wasn't just about a moment in the future. It wasn't even about the solitude shown in the photo. Someone, or something tied to that future, was already crossing into my present, and whatever waited for me on that rocky outcrop wasn't confined to the day printed on the photograph. It had already begun. I barely slept that night. I lay in bed with the photograph on the nightstand beside me, its presence impossible to ignore. Every time I closed my eyes, the image returned. The older version of me, standing alone on the outcrop, hands raised slightly as if acknowledging something. But in those moments between waking and dreaming, I sometimes saw another detail added to the scene, a shape in the distance or a faint outline approaching me. Each time I sat up, the room was still, the night unchanged. Sleep refused to take me anywhere quieter. By dawn, my thoughts were heavy. I pulled myself out of bed and walked to the kitchen, my steps slow and uneven. The fog outside had lifted slightly, revealing a muted blue light stretching across the sky. The harbor would still be quiet at this hour, but I felt no desire to go out on the water. I needed answers more than I needed routine. I poured a cup of coffee and sat at the table. The photograph lay where I'd left it the night before, flat, harmless, unchanged. The smudge I'd noticed earlier was still there, faint but visible. I traced the edge of the paper lightly, careful not to touch the print. The house felt colder this morning, the air carrying a stillness I didn't recognize. After finishing the coffee, I decided to step outside. The early air brushed against my face with a crispness that reminded me of late autumn, though we were still weeks away. I walked down the path that led to the small road connecting the houses along the harbor. Everything was quiet. No barking dogs, no early fishermen, no truck engines warming in driveways. Too quiet for a town that usually began its day before the sun. Halfway toward the docks, I noticed footprints on the damp gravel. Not many, just one set, leading from the direction of my house toward the main road. The steps were faint, partially smudged by fog dew, but fresh enough to stand out. They didn't match my boot size. They were narrower, longer. Adrian. I followed the footprints for several yards until they faded into the road, lost in the scattered gravel. I stood there for a moment, staring at the ground, feeling a strange mix of relief and dread. If Adrian had been near my house, then I hadn't imagined the sound from the night before. But why come so close without speaking? Why observe instead of stepping forward? I sighed and continued toward the harbor. The boats rocked gently in the morning light, their ropes straining softly against the posts. The air carried the familiar scent of salt and fish, a scent that usually grounded me. Today, it only made me more aware of how different everything felt. I walked to the end of the dock and leaned against one of the posts, staring out at the open water. The tide was low, exposing dark patches of seaweed along the shore. The lighthouse in the distance stood firm against the pale sky. That outcrop just beyond it pulled at my attention again, the way a name half-remembered does when it refuses to leave your mind. Why had I been standing there alone in the future? Why had Adrian given me the photograph? What was I supposed to understand? While I was lost in thought, a voice beside me broke the silence. "You're out here early today." I turned sharply. It was Mrs. Clancy, an older woman who lived 2 houses down from mine. She had a small dog that followed her everywhere, though it wasn't with her now. Her shoulders were hunched slightly from age, and she wore a thick knit sweater despite the mild temperature. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she studied me. "Couldn't sleep much," I said, steadying my breath. She nodded, shifting her weight. "I saw someone near your place last night. Thought it was strange at that hour." My chest tightened. "Someone? Did you recognize who it was?" She shook her head slowly. "No. Tall, though. Stood near your porch for a while. Didn't move." She hesitated before adding, "It looked like he was waiting." A cold ripple moved down my back. "Waiting for what?" "For you, maybe." I almost called out, but something told me not to. She looked down the dock, her voice lowering. There was something unsettling about him, like he wasn't sure if he should stay or go. "Adrian, it had to be. But why watch me? Why silently return?" Mrs. Clancy patted my arm gently before walking away. "Be careful, Ray." I watched her leave, her steps slow but steady. As she disappeared into the fog, I felt an uneasy truth forming inside me. Adrian wasn't just delivering a message. He was watching its effect, watching me. And whatever lay ahead on that rocky outcrop wasn't just a future moment. It was a meeting, one he wasn't sure I was ready for, one I wasn't sure I wanted. I stayed on the dock long after Mrs. Clancy disappeared into the thinning fog. Her words echoed through me like a quiet knock on a door I didn't want to open. Someone had been standing near my porch. Someone tall, someone waiting. There weren't many tall men in our town, and even fewer who would walk around in near silence at night. Adrian fit the description too well to dismiss. Yet the idea of him standing in the dark outside my home didn't feel threatening. It felt deliberate, a man watching the edge of something he wasn't sure how to approach. The more I thought about it, the more a strange possibility crept in. Maybe he wasn't watching me. Maybe he was watching the photograph. I ran a hand over my face and exhaled slowly, forcing my thoughts to settle. I wasn't going to get answers by standing on the dock. The outcrop was still out of reach today, the photograph's details telling me the moment hadn't arrived. But something was shifting, something drawing me forward even as I tried to hold my ground. I walked back toward my boat, not to head out to sea, but to check something. The cabin door creaked open easily, and I stepped inside, scanning the narrow space. A few coils of rope hung neatly along the wall. A faded jacket rested on a hook. Tools lay arranged in a small drawer I kept organized out of habit. Nothing seemed out of place. I crouched and looked beneath the bench, half expecting, half dreading, to find something left behind. A sign, a note, a message. But the space was empty, just as I'd left it. Still, something tugged at me, an uneasiness that wouldn't settle. I checked the glove compartment of the small console, even though I hadn't stored anything meaningful there in years. Old receipts, a spare compass, a rusted multi-tool, nothing that hinted at Adrian's presence. I leaned back against the bench and stared at the floor. If he had come onto my boat, he'd done it without disturbing anything. If he had walked around my house, he'd done it without leaving a trace except for the faint footprint I'd seen in the gravel. He was being careful. He was being cautious. He was being respectful. But why? I stood and stepped out of the cabin, letting the wind sweep across my face. A gull passed overhead, its call sharp and lonely. The tide had begun to rise again, bringing with it a slow, steady rhythm that tugged at the posts beneath the dock. It reminded me of something I hadn't let myself consider. Maybe the moment in the photograph wasn't just about solitude. Maybe it was about choice. I walked toward the edge of the dock and sat down, letting my legs dangle above the water. The surface rippled below, catching the pale light of the late morning. I watched the patterns shift and scatter, losing themselves as quickly as they formed. A thought rose quietly in the back of my mind, one I had avoided since I first saw the image. What if the older version of me wasn't alone because he had no one left? What if he chose to be there, away from everyone else? The idea unsettled me more than the photograph itself. For years after my wife passed, I had clung to solitude like a safety rope. It kept me from facing conversations I wasn't ready to have, and from accepting help I didn't know how to receive. I'd use the sea as an excuse to stay away from the people who cared. It wasn't intentional, not at first, but distance grows quietly when left alone, like fog thickening over the water. What if the future version of me had simply followed that path to its final point? What if Adrian had seen it unfold, step by step, until there was no one left in my life but me? A soft scrape on the dock behind me snapped me out of my thoughts. I turned quickly, heart tightening, but it was only a stray piece of rope shifting in the wind. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. I stood, brushing off my hands, and walked away from the edge. The photograph weighed heavily in my pocket, its edges sharp against the fabric. I didn't need to look at it now. I knew the image well enough to recall every detail without seeing it. As I made my way back toward the road, one realization followed me like a shadow. If Adrian was watching the edges of my future, he wasn't doing it from a distance. He was close enough to hear me if I spoke, close enough to step forward if I drifted too far off course. And as much as that unsettled me, part of me wondered something I wasn't ready to say aloud. Was he waiting for me? Or was he waiting for the moment shown in the photograph? I walked the narrow road back toward my house, the gravel crunching under my boots in a slow, steady rhythm. The fog had thinned enough to show the outline of rooftops and the faint curve of the shoreline, but the air still carried a heaviness that clung to each breath. I kept my hands in my pockets, fingers brushing against the folded photograph. I didn't need to take it out again. Not right now. Its image was etched firmly in my mind. Halfway home, I stopped. Across the road, near a cluster of spruce trees, was a figure. A man, standing as still as stone. For a split second, I thought it was Adrian. The posture was similar, upright, composed, watching. But something felt different. The shoulders were broader, the head slightly tilted, the stance less cautious and more expectant. I blinked, and the fog shifted. The figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared. I stood frozen, staring at the empty space. My heartbeat thudded in my chest, loud enough to drown out the faint sounds of the harbor. I wasn't someone who imagined things easily. Years on the water teach you to trust your senses, not doubt them. And yet the more the fog rolled, the more uncertain I became. I took a step toward the trees but stopped before reaching the other side of the road. If someone had been there, they didn't want to be found. Or maybe they simply couldn't stay long enough for me to approach. Whatever the truth, the message was the same. I wasn't the only one watching my future approach. When I finally reached my house, the porch boards groaned under my weight. I paused before opening the door, taking in the silence of the neighborhood. Nothing moved. No wind rattled the loose shutters. Even the usual sounds of morning traffic from the nearby road were absent. It felt as if the whole town had stepped back, giving space to something I wasn't supposed to understand yet. Inside, the house felt colder than when I'd left it. I walked through each room not because I expected to find someone there, but because I needed the familiar space to remind me of where I still stood. Here, in the present, not in the moment shown in that photograph. Everything was as I'd left it, except the photograph on the coffee table. I had taken it with me earlier, but now there was another piece of paper lying in its place. A small slip folded once down the middle. My stomach tightened. For a long moment, I didn't move toward it. I just stared, trying to understand what I was seeing. No one else had my key. No one else had reason to come inside. And yet the paper lay there, waiting. Slowly, I reached down and picked it up. The fold was crisp. The paper felt warm, as if it had been held recently. My fingers hesitated before opening it. Inside, written in neat, careful handwriting, was a single line. "You will understand when the tide changes." No name, no signature, no explanation. I read the line again, and a cold awareness settled into me. The tide in the photograph had been higher, near evening, when the water swelled against the rocks. If the message was connected to that moment, then whoever had left it believed the timing mattered. It wasn't just the day that was fixed, it was the hour. I sank onto the couch, the note trembling slightly in my hand. My breath felt unsteady, as if the air had grown thinner. If Adrian had left the message, why not speak to me directly? And if it wasn't him, if someone else knew what was coming, then the photograph was only a part of something much larger. The room felt smaller suddenly, the corners darker. I stood and moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside. The fog had lifted just enough to show the distant line of the sea. The water shifted in slow, long breaths, moving with a rhythm I'd known my entire life. But today, it looked different. It looked deliberate, as if the tide itself were waiting. I stepped back, letting the curtain fall, and held the note tightly between my fingers. The truth came quietly, not as a shock, but as a slow realization settling into my bones. Adrian wasn't the only one tied to the moment in the photograph. Someone else knew where I would stand. Someone else had seen that future too, and whoever they were, they wanted me to reach it, not by accident, not by time alone, but by choice. I must have read that note a dozen times before I finally set it down. You will understand when the tide changes. The words echoed in my mind like something half-remembered, familiar in rhythm, but not in meaning. My hands felt unsteady, the way they used to after long nights steering through rough weather. Except the sea wasn't causing this tremor. The future was. For a while I simply sat there staring at the coffee table, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the occasional settling creak of the house. The silence should have comforted me. It always had. But now it felt like a layer between me and something approaching, something I could sense but not see. I stood up slowly, needing movement, needing air. I walked to the door and stepped out onto the porch. The sun had begun to climb behind the fog, turning the sky a muted silver. The air smelled like damp wood and cold salt, a scent I'd known forever but that now felt heavier, as if it carried a message I hadn't yet learned to read. I looked toward the road. No footprints this time, no shape in the fog, no watching figure. But the stillness of the morning carried the same feeling as before, the sense of being observed, not out of malice, but out of necessity, like I was a man moving toward a moment someone else needed me to reach. I walked down the steps and followed the small path toward the shoreline. The wet grass brushed my boots as I moved, and the distant cry of a gull cut through the quiet. When I reached the edge of the harbor, I stopped. The tide was low, far lower than it had been when I left the docks earlier. Strips of dark seaweed clung to the rocks, exposed and glistening. Pools of water reflected the sky like broken mirrors. I watched the slow pull of the water, noticing each shift, each inhale and exhale of the sea. I had spent my whole life reading tides, but today I felt as though the tide were reading me. The note said I would understand when the tide changed, and tides only change when something else begins. I turned and followed the harbor edge until the path opened near the lighthouse road. The lighthouse stood tall and motionless, a pale silhouette against the thinning fog. The rocky outcrop was hidden behind the bend, but I felt its presence like a tug behind my ribs. I knew I should walk there now, force the moment, confront it, but something inside held me back. Not fear, not avoidance, something closer to instinct. The photograph hadn't shown a sky like this or a tide like this. The moment depicted in it wasn't now, and forcing myself there early felt like stepping into someone else's shoes instead of my own. I turned away from the lighthouse and walked back toward town. The road was empty, the houses quiet. A few windows glowed faintly as people started their days, unaware of the shifts occurring around me. I wondered if anyone else had ever experienced something like this. A future folding in on a present day so silently that only one person noticed. As I passed by Mrs. Clancy's house, her curtains moved slightly, though I didn't see her inside. Maybe she was watching me again. Or maybe the shift in the curtain had been the breeze. It was harder now to trust what I saw and what I didn't. When I reached my house again, I found myself hesitating on the porch. I opened the door slowly, half expecting another note, another sign. But the living room was exactly as I'd left it. The coffee table, the chair, the lamp, stillness. Only the photograph seemed alive. It lay on the table with the faintest curve to its edges, as if the air itself were bending it. I walked toward it with careful steps, each one quieter than the last. When I picked it up, the coldness of the paper pulsed through my fingers. I stared at the image, my future self waiting on the rocks with the tide high behind him. A realization settled slowly, filling my chest. The note hadn't been telling me to go somewhere. It had been telling me when this moment would arrive. The tide would rise again soon. And when it did, understanding wouldn't be a choice. It would be an arrival. I placed the photograph on the table again and let my hands fall to my sides. For the first time since Adrian appeared on the wharf, I felt something shift in me, an understanding that wasn't complete, not yet, but close enough to draw breath in a different way. The tide wasn't just a detail in the picture. It was the signal, the marker, the beginning of the moment I'd eventually walk into. But that didn't explain the note left in my house, or the figure I thought I'd seen in the fog, or why the photograph seemed to shift when no one touched it. If the future was approaching, it wasn't doing so quietly. It was brushing against the present like two currents pushing in opposite directions. I took the photograph and the note and placed them carefully inside my jacket before stepping out of the house again. The air outside had changed, colder, sharper, as though the day had aged suddenly. Thin streaks of clouds stretched across the sky, pale and fast-moving. I knew weather shifts well, and this one didn't feel natural. It carried a tension I couldn't explain. I walked without deciding where I was going, letting instinct tug me down the familiar road leading toward the water. A few people were out now, beginning their routines, carrying nets, checking traps, sweeping porches. They nodded to me in passing, their expressions unreadable behind the morning light. None of them sensed anything unusual. Or maybe they did, and they were just better at hiding it. As I reached the docks again, I slowed. Something felt different in the air, lighter but alert, like the pause before a distant engine turns over. I stepped onto the boards and listened to the faint groaning of wood under the tide's pull. The water had risen slightly since earlier, though it wasn't high enough to match the photograph. Not yet. The outcrop was waiting but not calling. That difference mattered. I sat at the edge of the dock, folding my arms against the cold. The fog drifted across the surface of the water in thin ribbons, revealing glimpses of the horizon in small, quiet breaths. I watched it move, watched the way it thinned and thickened, trying to read it like I had read tides my entire life. A soft scrape behind me made me turn. This time there was no mistaking the sound. Footsteps on the dock. Slow, measured, deliberate. My breath tightened. I stood carefully, not wanting to make the wrong assumption, not wanting to spook whoever approached. But when I turned fully, the dock behind me was empty. Empty in the way a path is empty just after someone steps away from it. The boards were still vibrating. Someone had been there seconds before. I scanned the edges of the fog, half expecting a shape to step forward, but the mist only drifted, silent and indifferent. "Adrian," I said quietly, not shouting his name, just offering it to the air. No answer, but I felt something change. The air seemed to thicken around me, the temperature dropping just enough to raise the hairs on my arms. I wasn't alone. Not entirely. I walked slowly to the end of the dock, where the water deepened and the fog hovered like a watchful veil. The tide pulsed below, steady and slow, as if breathing beneath the planks. Then, from the corner of my vision, I saw movement. Not a person, not a shadow. Something small, quick, a glint of light along the boards. I knelt, narrowing my eyes. A thin piece of metal lay wedged between two planks. I reached for it, hesitating before lifting it carefully. A button, cold, smooth, a little scratched. I knew it instantly. It belonged to Adrian's coat. My chest tightened with a strange mixture of dread and clarity. He had been here, and recently. But why leave this behind? By accident or on purpose? I turned the button over in my hand. It wasn't broken. It hadn't snapped off. It looked placed, as if removed intentionally and left where I would find it. The message was subtle, but unmistakable. I'm still here. I'm closer than you think, and this isn't finished. I slipped the button into my pocket and stood, feeling the tide's changing rhythm beneath my feet. The moment in the photograph was approaching. Not rushed, not forced, but inevitable. Whether I understood it or not, the tides were moving in a direction I could no longer ignore. And whatever waited for me on that outcrop, I wasn't walking toward it alone anymore. Something else, or someone else, was walking with me. I held the button in my palm longer than I meant to, turning it slowly between my fingers. It wasn't heavy, but it carried a weight that settled deep in my chest. Adrian had been here, recently, intentionally, close enough to leave something behind without being seen, or close enough to know I would come looking. But why leave a single button? Why not a note like before? Why not speak? The longer I stared at it, the more I realized the button meant something simple. He wanted me to know he wasn't disappearing. Not yet. I tucked it carefully into my pocket and looked out over the water again. The tide continued its slow climb, creeping higher along the pilings. A faint breeze brushed across my face, cool enough to carry the first hint of an incoming front. The shift was subtle, but I'd felt enough weather changes to recognize when something was building, when the air thickened with meaning instead of moisture. I took a steadying breath and left the dock, walking the short slope back toward the town road. Boats clinked softly against their moorings behind me. The fog began to thin, revealing the distant outline of the lighthouse and, beyond it, the dark rise of the outcrop. Even from this distance, the rocks looked sharper today, like the land itself was bracing for something. Back home, I placed the button on the table beside the photograph, lining them up carefully. The image looked no different than before, but after finding the button, I could almost feel a pull coming from it. A quiet insistence that I look again. I picked up the photograph, studying the details with a new kind of concentration. The rocks, the tide, the angle of my stance, the dim, overcast sky. But my eyes kept falling back to the shoreline behind my future self, tracing the edges where rock met water. Something felt off, something I hadn't noticed before. I angled the photo slightly under the light. There, barely visible. A faint disturbance in the water behind me, not a shape, not a reflection, but the suggestion of movement, like a ripple caught mid-gesture. My breath tightened. What had I been looking at in that moment? Who, or what, had been standing where the photograph refused to show? I set the picture down, unable to look at it any longer. The silence in the house felt heavier than the fog outside. I needed air. I walked to the back door and stepped out into the yard, letting the cool breeze roll over me. The grass was damp, bending slightly with each shift of wind. The sky overhead was darker now, streaked with long, low clouds. As I stood there, I heard something faint, so faint I almost dismissed it. A soft snap of twigs, the crunch of gravel shifting. Behind the house. I turned slowly, heartbeat rising. The yard was empty. The low fence at the edge of the property stood quiet, undisturbed. But something in the air had changed. An awareness, a presence, the same subtle shift I'd felt at the dock before hearing those steps. "Adrian," I said softly, the name slipping out more from instinct than hope. No answer. I waited, scenting the air, listening for the faintest sign of movement. Nothing came, only the distant sound of waves hitting the rocks far down the shoreline. I walked toward the fence, scanning the ground. The grass still looked undisturbed, and the gravel path held no new prints. Yet the feeling persisted, that faint sense of being watched, not with malice, but with intent. I spoke again, barely above a whisper. "If you're here, just tell me what you want." The breeze lifted, brushing across the yard. A single sheet of old newspaper, a scrap that must have blown in from somewhere, skated across the gravel and caught against the fence. I didn't move to pick it up. It meant nothing. But the timing made the silence feel louder. Eventually I stepped back toward the porch. Standing still in the yard wasn't going to give me answers. I needed movement. I needed clarity. Inside the house, the photograph seemed to draw my attention like a magnet. I walked toward it slowly. The button beside it looked almost symbolic now, as if marking a place, the way fishermen leave signals along the shore. I picked up the button again. The metal felt warmer now, almost as if it had been held recently. I pressed it lightly between my fingers and felt a strange certainty rise through me. Quiet, undeniable. Adrian wasn't lost. He wasn't gone. He was waiting for the tide, and when it changed, he expected me to be ready. I set the button down carefully and traced the edge of the photograph once more. The moment it showed wasn't just approaching, it was converging, drawing the present and the future closer with each passing hour. Then, for the first time, a new thought surfaced, so sudden and sharp it made me grip the table for balance. What if Adrian wasn't coming to meet the man in the photograph at all? What if he was coming to meet me before I became him? The difference felt enormous, and the tide was still rising. I didn't try to distract myself that afternoon. There was no point. The photograph sat on the table, the button beside it, and both felt like anchors tying me to a moment that hadn't happened yet, but was beginning to shape everything around me. The tide was rising. I could feel it not just in the air or in the smell of the harbor, but somewhere deeper, as if the sea were pulling at something inside my chest. A little past midday, the clouds had thickened into a low gray sheet that dulled the coastline. I stepped outside, closing the door gently behind me, and felt the wind shift. Colder, more deliberate, the kind of wind that signaled an incoming change, even when no storm was forecast. The sky wasn't threatening, but it wasn't calm either. It carried a quiet tension. I walked toward the harbor again, following the narrow road with slow, steady steps. I wasn't heading anywhere specific at first. I just knew I needed to be outside, closer to the sea. The houses stood silent as I passed, curtains drawn to the gray light. A dog barked once behind a fence and then fell silent, as if even it sensed something unusual in the air. When I reached the docks, the tide had climbed higher than I'd expected. The water lapped at the lower boards, pushing gentle swells against the pylons. The fog was thinner now, drifting in soft sheets that revealed brief glimpses of the lighthouse and the rocky outcrop beyond. Every time it cleared, I saw that stretch of stone more clearly. Dark, wet, waiting. I wasn't ready to go there yet, not until the tides matched the photograph, but I felt myself being pulled toward it anyway. As I walked along the dock, I noticed something that made me stop. A rope hanging over the edge, swaying gently in the current. It wasn't mine. It wasn't tied to any boat. It looked like someone had dropped it there and stepped away before securing it. I knelt and pulled it up. The rope was damp, cold, but recently handled. Someone had been here after the tide began to rise. Someone who had stood long enough for the rope to get wet, but not long enough for it to sink completely. Adrian. The thought wasn't a guess, it was certainty. I stood and scanned the docks, searching for movement, a shadow, anything. But the fog hid more than it revealed. A gull flew low overhead, its wings slicing through the air in a sharp glide. I watched it disappear into the mist before turning back toward the main road. I didn't know where I should go, so I let instinct guide me, back home, but slowly, as if the walk itself were part of what I needed to understand. When I reached my porch, something else was waiting, a damp footprint on the wood, near the top step. One single print, narrow, longer than mine. My breath caught quietly in my throat. He'd been here again, not trying to hide, not entirely avoiding me, just waiting, or watching, or making sure I stayed on the path he needed me to follow. I stepped past the footprint carefully and went inside. The air felt cooler than before, sharper. The curtains shifted slightly, though no breeze touched them. I walked to the table and found the photograph exactly where I left it, but the button had moved an inch to the right. Not much, but enough. I sat down slowly, resting both hands on the table. I didn't touch anything. I just breathed, steadying myself, waiting for whatever realization was trying to reach me. The room felt different, like the distance between now and the moment in the photograph was thinning. I lifted the photograph again and studied the title line behind my future self, the height of the water, the shadow of the rocks, the direction of the wind captured in the small ripples along the surface. All of it pointed to a tide that hadn't arrived yet, but would soon. The note had said, "You will understand when the tide changes." The tide was changing. I set the photo down and looked around the room with new clarity. The shadows in the corners, the slight bend of the curtains, the cooling air. These weren't signs of someone inside. They were signs of proximity, of presence, of a moment pressing closer. I felt it then, quiet, unmistakable. I wasn't waiting for the future. The future was waiting for me, and someone, Adrian or someone tied to him, was making sure I got there before the tide turned fully. Everything in me knew what that meant. Soon, I would have to walk back to the outcrop, not because the photograph told me to, not because Adrian wanted me to, but because the moment itself was calling. A meeting set long before today, and the tide was almost right. I stayed seated at the table for a long time, listening. The house held a stillness that wasn't empty this time. It was expectant. A quiet space waiting for a question I hadn't asked yet. My palms rested flat against the wood, and with each breath I felt the faint pulse of the tide through the floorboards, as if the sea itself was drawing closer. Eventually, I stood and walked to the window. The sky had darkened further, the clouds settling into a heavy gray sheet that dimmed the light across the harbor. The air carried the unmistakable change of an approaching high tide, a deeper smell of salt, the subtle pressure of rising water, the tightening rhythm of the waves against the rocks. I checked the time. The tide would peak soon, within the next hour. My heartbeat matched its pace. I turned back to the table and picked up the photograph again. The image felt heavier now, as if the future moment it held was leaning into the present with all its weight. I studied every detail once more, but not to decode it this time. I knew that wouldn't work. Instead, I was trying to understand how it felt, how he felt, the older version of me standing on those rocks. His posture wasn't fearful. It wasn't tense. It was steady. He wasn't resisting the moment. He was welcoming it. That realization sent a quiet shiver down my spine. I slipped the photograph into my jacket and grabbed the note that had been left on my table. I read the line again, "You will understand when the tide changes," and folded the paper carefully before sliding it into my pocket. Then I stepped outside. The air had grown colder, though not sharply. It was the kind of cold that settled into your clothes rather than your skin. The fog had nearly lifted by now, leaving a soft haze in the distance that blurred the horizon. And as I walked down the road, I felt something I hadn't felt before. Not fear, not urgency, but a quiet acceptance that this day was moving towards something I couldn't stop. People passed me on their porches or in their yards, but they didn't speak. Their eyes followed me for a moment and then drifted away, as if they sensed I was walking towards something private and distant. The world felt thinner around me, the edges softer, the sound of my steps louder than usual. When I reached the harbor, I stopped. The tide had risen dramatically. The water pressed higher along the pylons, swirling in small circles. The lighthouse stood clearer now that the fog had thinned, and behind it, barely visible through the shifting light, the rocky outcrop waited, dark and glistening. The moment was coming. I stepped onto the dock, and the wood groaned beneath my weight. The air smelled stronger, cleaner, sharper, with the rising sea. I walked to the far edge and stared out across the water. My boat bobbed quietly where I'd tied it earlier. The small rope hung exactly as it had been, though now it was nearly submerged beneath the tide. As I watched it, I felt another presence, close, quiet, measured. I turned slowly. A shape stood at the far end of the dock, still, tall, unmoving. Adrian. He didn't step forward, didn't raise a hand, didn't speak. He simply stood there, as if waiting for me to decide whether I'd approach or keep my distance. The wind curled around him, faintly lifting the edges of his coat, but his posture didn't shift. I took a single step toward him. He didn't move, but something in the air tightened. Another step. Still nothing. By the third step, I could see his expression. Not fearful, not urgent, but deeply tired. The same look he'd worn when he handed me the photograph. A look that held more sorrow than warning. "What is it?" I asked softly, the words barely leaving my throat. Adrian lowered his gaze to the water for a moment before lifting it back to me. His face stayed calm, but his voice, when he finally spoke, carried a strain I hadn't heard before. "It's almost time, Ray." The wind shifted, brushing past us like a passing thought. "The tide?" I asked. He nodded once. "It's bringing something with it." My breath caught. "What?" He held my eyes for a long moment, then looked past me, toward the lighthouse, toward the outcrop. "You." The single word struck me harder than any explanation he could have given. He wasn't talking about the present me. He was talking about the man in the photograph, the version of me waiting just beyond the tide's turn. Adrian stepped back, giving me space, not guiding me, not leading me, but allowing me to choose. And I realized then, this was the moment before the moment, the breath before the step, the tide rising not to warn me, but to meet me. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The wind brushed between us, carrying the rising smell of the tide. Adrian kept his distance, giving me space as if he knew the decision ahead wasn't something he could shape, only witness. The clouds shifted overhead, thickening from soft gray to something heavier. Though the air didn't feel threatening, it felt expectant. I glanced once more at the lighthouse. Beyond it, the dark line of the outcrop waited, clearer than before. The tide spilled around its edges in slow, deliberate motion, like a hand sweeping across stone. In the photograph, the water had risen nearly to the point where the flatter rocks began. It wasn't there yet, but it was close, close enough that I felt it rising in my chest. My hands tightened at my sides. I turned back to Adrian. "Why me?" I asked quietly. The question felt too big for the space between us. His eyes softened. "Because you were always going to stand there." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I can give you." I shook my head, though part of me understood what he meant. There are moments in a man's life that grow inside him long before he reaches them. Decisions made quietly through years of silence, losses carried without words, regrets that shape us more strongly than we admit. Maybe the man in the photograph wasn't created by fate or time travel, but by all the choices I had allowed to deepen inside me. Still, I needed more. "What happens there?" I asked. What was I looking at? Adrian hesitated, and in that breath, the air around us seemed to still. "Some questions aren't meant to be answered early," he said gently. "Understanding comes at the moment itself." "That's not good enough." "It's all I have, Ray." I wanted to be angry. I wanted to demand answers he wouldn't give, but instead, a quiet weight settled into me. A truth I'd felt forming ever since I first saw the photograph. This wasn't a warning. It wasn't a threat. It was a crossing. A place where the path I had lived met the path I was becoming. The tide pressed higher along the pylons, the sound deepening. Adrian looked toward the water and spoke again, his voice softer this time. "You're closer than you think." He didn't step toward me, but something in him leaned forward in a way that wasn't physical, like he was preparing for something only he had seen before. The wind shifted again, colder, bringing with it the distant crash of waves hitting the rocks beyond the lighthouse. The sound rolled across the harbor, steady and heavy. I felt it in my chest, the way one feels approaching weather. Not fear, but inevitability. I swallowed. "Will you be there?" His expression tightened with something like regret. "No." "Then who am I meeting?" Adrian didn't answer immediately. He looked down at the water, then back at me. "Yourself," he said finally. "But not the way you expect." The word struck me with a sharpness I wasn't prepared for. My throat felt dry. "You mean the man in the photograph?" "Yes," he said. "And no." I stepped closer. "What does that mean?" He held my gaze, and in his eyes, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. Age. Not in his face, but in his expression. A deep tiredness. "You'll understand when the tide reaches the rocks," he said softly. The same message as the note, but heavier now. Final. As if he were handing the responsibility from his hands to mine. "Ray," he added quietly, "you're not walking into danger. You're walking into truth." The wind shifted again, carrying a faint chill. The clouds moved just enough to reveal a thin line of pale light across the water. The tide swelled in a long, slow breath. The moment was close. I glanced once more toward the outcrop. Through the thinning haze, I could see a dark shape. Maybe a cluster of rocks, maybe just shadow. But something in it stirred a memory I couldn't place. A recognition that came not from the past, but from somewhere ahead. When I turned back to Adrian, he had taken a step backward, as if the space between us needed to widen now. "Go when the tide touches the first flat stone," he said. "Not before." "And after?" His eyes softened in a way that felt like farewell. "After, trust what you see." The wind lifted, brushing against his coat. For a second the world felt stretched, the air thinner, the sounds distant, as if time were bending just enough for us to feel the edges of its shift. I wanted to say more. I wanted to hold him in the moment and demand clarity, demand reason, demand something human to root myself in. But the tide was rising, and the outcrop was waiting. Adrian gave me one last look, steady, somber, final. Then he turned, and as the fog slid past him, he stepped into it, and didn't step out again. When Adrian disappeared into the fog, the sound of the harbor seemed to fall away with him. I stood on the dock for a long time, staring at the place where he'd last been, waiting for the fog to shift or lift or give him back. It didn't. The air stayed still, the world quiet, and the tide continued to rise with its slow, unavoidable pull. Eventually, I turned toward the lighthouse. The path leading there felt different now, lighter and heavier at the same time, as if every step carried both weight and release. I walked it slowly, listening to the distant sound of the water hitting the rocks, the same rhythm I'd known my entire life. Only today, it felt like the rhythm had learned my name. By the time I reached the bend that hid the outcrop, the tide had touched the first flat stone, just as the note had said. I stepped onto the rocks with careful feet, feeling the sea push around me. The world seemed sharper here, the air colder, the sky closer, the water louder. And at the center of the outcrop, where the version of me in the photograph had stood, I saw him. He wasn't a stranger. He wasn't a ghost. He wasn't older or younger than I remembered. He was simply me, a reflection shaped not by mirrors but by time. He stood quietly facing the horizon. When I stepped beside him, he didn't look surprised. He didn't look afraid. He didn't say a word. He simply lifted his hand slightly, the same gesture the photograph had captured, and for the first time, I understood it. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't regret. It wasn't surrender. It was recognition, a moment meeting itself. And as the tide rose around our feet, something inside me settled, like the sea finding its level. I didn't look away. I didn't step back. I stood with him, until the moment passed, and the future became the present again.